greet you with peace. My name is Tiffany Steinward, and I am the Dean of Hendricks Chapel. And it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce to you tonight one of my dearest friends and colleagues, the Reverend Dr. Kirk VanGilder. I first met Kirk in graduate school where we were studying practical theology together. I say that at some point I was supposed to be the teacher and Kirk was the learner, but in fact we were always co-learners together. I soon found out that if I had a question about anything, and I mean anything, Kirk was the person to ask. He today is one of our nation's leading practical theologians. From his engaging scholarship to brilliant insights, Kirk shakes the foundation not just of the church, but of theological establishments. He asks questions no one has dared to ask before, and suggests answers in a nonchalant, unassuming way that has the power to revolutionize not just the field, but the world. Kirk VanGilder was born hard of hearing before losing more hearing in late adolescence and transitioning into the deaf world. He is an ordained United Methodist clergyperson and has served as a minister in deaf churches in Baltimore and Pasadena, Maryland, as well as a campus minister to Gallaudet University. And what is not included in the script I prepared is he also served as co-pastor of Cambridge Welcoming Ministries with me, and I don't know how I left that out of the official bio. Kirk has also traveled to Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Turkey to work with deaf community development and support. His dissertation, which has now been published as a book, is called Making Sadza with Deaf Zimbabwean Women, a missiological reinterpretation of the practical theological method. Kirk hopes to continue his travels and research in other countries, as well as present his findings and experience to a wide variety of scholarly and non-scholarly audiences. The event tonight is a wonderful collaboration across campus of many different departments and offices coming together. Hendricks Chapel, the Interfaith Student Council, Interfaith Student Alliance, the Secular Student Alliance, the Disability Student Union, the Disability Cultural Center, the Center on Human Policy, Law, and Disability Studies, the Department of Religion, the Beyond Compliance Coordinating Committee, and CUES ASL. So without further ado, I invite you to welcome Dr. Kirk VanGilder.
I'm actually going to wait just a couple of minutes to see if we can take care of technical issues with the cart that's supposed to be showing up on the screen here. So hold on for just a second. We'll see what happens. I know some people are actually going to be dependent on reading the captions as they go, oh, here we go. I see them on the screen right now. Tiffany, thank you so much for the introduction. Her name sign is indicative of her height. Something related to religion tonight, as well as disability, deaf, secularism, and identity. So let's see, how many pieces of that I have to, let's see if I could mix them all together, juggle them up in the air, and drop them on the floor, and then put them all together and create something that's a synthesis of the diverse issues and the ideas, and put them into one brief lecture. This is the task that Tiffany gave to me. So this is actually an open topic that I'd like to have a dialogue with each other tonight. Maybe I can give you some ideas of what I'm thinking about to lead the discussion, but to start with, I'd like to talk about what conversations are happening here at Syracuse University and what the campus is facing, what issues the campus is facing within the community of Syracuse University. So here's my fancy title, Without Walls. It should be Without Walls and then colon, what temporary deaf spaces can tell us about managing identity politics. So identity labels, as you can see on this slide here. Hello, my name is, and then I have to pick one identity to put on that sticker when I introduce myself to a new community. Hello, my name is, what identity do I pick? Out of all the collections that make up who you are and your identity, as you can see up here, we have a selection from disabled to jock to Latina to blind, how do you pick one of those? Maybe you have multiple identities within one person. So to say, hello, my name is Kirk, what does that mean to you to know that I label myself as Kirk? Or maybe from your perspective, what does that mean when you think of what a Kirk is? And then what does that say when I say, my name is Kirk? What does that mean for me? And that's the identity that I've chosen to label myself with. So we start to use labels to describe who we are, and then we get a vision of all the different labels that we attach to ourselves and we attach to other people. We love labels and we also hate labels. America has a love-hate relationship with labels, but labels are very vital, very critical, and we use them, we have to embrace them to label ourselves. But if you conversely label someone else, that person may not take that label right away. So we're going to be talking about identity, and we're going to think about the vocabulary and the language we use and the concepts we use about identity. But language can also be a way to segregate ourselves and can have a negative impact on how we identify ourselves and what groups we choose to identify with. Maybe we have multiple names and multiple identities, and how do we begin to manage these multiple identities to converse with people and to share a part of who we are? And then when you meet another person or several other people in the community, how do you develop community and group identity with everyone having their individual labels and the many identities that they have and the plethora of entities that we bring together? How do we as a community get group identity? And identity, that label, does not have to be permanent. Who you are right here, right now, tonight, listening to my presentation, is very different from who you were yesterday afternoon, or maybe after this lecture when you sit and have a nice chat with a friend, or when you go home and you visit your family. Who you are in that situation, or who you are when you go out to party tonight, is different than who you are right now. So that changes, is influenced by who you are dialoguing with, and it's not a permanent thing. It's fluid. It's very flexible. It moves very easily from one identity to another. So we have that love-hate relationship with labels, and those labels can be fixed. Those identities can be fixed, but they don't have to be fixed. They don't always have to be fixed. Labels are fixed, but identities are not fixed. Labels are used to describe identity. So that's where we see a problem, a tension, how you understand yourself in a diverse world as a person who is very diverse yourself. So on the slide here, I have about 20 or 25 different labels that encompass culture, disability, deaf identity or blind, gender identity, political identity, and social economic class identity as well. So there's a selection of identities up here on the slide, and those are embraced by us. And those are sometimes identities that are given to us generationally, and sometimes that we create ourselves. Or maybe from high school to college, we transition to identity, or college to graduate school. These are identities that we create for ourselves. So, when you leave high school, you can say, okay, I've left high school's in the past, I'm moving on to college. Maybe as an undergrad you were party hardy instead of studying hard, or maybe not, I don't know, it depends on the individuals in the room here. But you can recreate your identity yourself. You select the labels, and you can inherit those labels as well. So think about how labels fuse with identities, as you can see on this slide here. What often happens, and why we often despair and disparage these labels, is that when we try to see each of these identities as individual, society has specific definitions for these labels, most of the time. Most of the time when they say this identity is such and such, they mean a specific definition. But it's an impossibility to have these identities all converge. And again, it creates a false sense of segregation. It would be nice if we had these specific lines between different identities, but by identity lines blur. It's very messy. And you try to pick these identities, and you can have some complex situations arise. My first class at Gallaudet University, I walked right in, sat down, and a discussion ensued. Everybody had to introduce themselves. And that class was a required class. It was cultural identity, and it was very open. It was kind of a who you are. This first assignment was to write a 2-page paper about who you are. And then we had to share what we had written with the class. So we kind of opened up about who we were and delved into each other's identities. And one student came up to the front of the class and said, this is my name. And she identified herself as a straight woman, but people often consider her as a lesbian, she says, because she says, my boyfriend is a woman. And half the class kind of went, huh? What? A straight woman who most people think is a lesbian because her boyfriend is a woman. So we had to kind of unpack that and see what that meant. Identifying straight means she identified as a woman, as of the sex of woman, but she was transgendered, and the person that she was in a relationship with is a boyfriend who was transgendered, but who was a performing artist who did not perform as that specific gender. So she was attracted to the male gender, not the actual sex of that person. So she identified herself as straight, but people read her as a lesbian because they saw who she was in a relationship with. And then they were thinking, well, this is a woman with another woman. So she introduced herself to class this way, and I thought, wow, that is fantastic. I mean, she has a clear understanding of her identity. And I was automatically able to look around the room and see who had not even thought about these kind of identities issues before. It was just a great opening class, and it was just a great way to kind of open the box and unpack what is an identity and how are identities put together. I'm going to introduce the concept of deaf gain here with this slide. I'll let you read the quote here. The quote, it says, at the onset of his deafness, and in parentheses, performing artist Aaron Williamson consulted many doctors, and they all told him the same thing. You're losing your hearing. He wondered why it was that not a single doctor told him he was gaining his deafness. So this is kind of reframing of the expectation of what hearing loss is. The opposite of hearing loss is deaf gain. When you lose something in a gradual way, then you perhaps benefit at something and you gain a different identity. So that concept actually is very popular right now in the scholarly world. Cultural identity and production and how that is produced and shown to the larger society. So if a person is deaf, then that means something that no one else in society compared to this person has that deafness. Because we are deaf, we give this, and without us deaf people in the society, there would not be hearing people, for example. You wouldn't have the dichotomy. So Williamson came up with this idea about deaf gain. Very interesting. There's a picture of him here, and he lives in England, in London. And he got a license to be a street performer, a busker. London is kind of an interesting city. If you visit there and you're walking the streets, you'll see various people performing, and Williamson was one of them. So he set up an old phonograph with a very, very old record player, an antique, and it would play opera music. And he, dressed to the nines in a tuxedo, would begin to sing with the music, completely deaf. with no idea whether what he was pronouncing vocally was matching what was being played with the music. So he would just go ahead and perform very seriously, as an opera singer is wont to do, and then he would notice people's reactions, their facial expression, just saying, what the heck, this guy's not matching the music at all, it sounds terrible, should we say something to him? And as the performance was going on, he would completely seriously continue to sing, and he would see that people in the audience were realizing that he was a very lousy musician, and then he would have a break, an intermission, and he would start signing away with a friend. And everyone in the audience would realize, oh my gosh, he's deaf. And so everyone else, all of the hearing people, let's say, who had just been saying what a lousy musician he was, were completely embarrassed, shamefaced, sheepishly saying, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize you were deaf, and they would, hand him a bunch of money. So he would just, very, very clever gig there. But so he would react to the crowd and how they would be making assumptions of him as a musician, a singer, and how they would change as soon as they realized he was deaf. So he performed as a deaf person. He was a performing artist. So he wasn't presenting himself as a deaf person as he was singing. He was presenting himself as a performing artist. So to think about the idea of deaf gain is to think about the flip of deaf being losing something. But think of it as being deaf and gaining something in becoming deaf. The two professors on the slide here are both Gallaudet University professors, and they have really delved into this scholarship, the idea of identity and deaf gain. And they liken this to the idea of helping people who are trying to be snowboarders. So how one person looks at deaf snowboarders competing as they're, I see we can see on TV on sports right now, on the X Games, you can see, deaf people who are snowboarding, and how they adapt and accommodate, how they're able to read the snow by feel with balance and vibration. And then compared to competitors who are hearing, they are able to maneuver and navigate through the snow by hearing. So they can hear where the snow is weak and where the snow is strong, because they're able to take those cues audibly. So these two Gallaudet University professors, again, looked at deaf snowboarders and realized that their reaction time was much quicker than the hearing snowboarders, because they were able to rely more quickly on their feeling rather than the hearing competitors who had to listen to the snow and be able to maneuver through it. There was a Swedish coach who trained their hearing snowboarders to put earplugs in, forcing them to begin to develop that sense of being able to rely on their feeling. And their competition and their ability to compete at a higher level increased. So that's just one example of deaf gain, and how you look at a situation and see what deaf people are doing and see that maybe they're doing something much more efficiently than the everyday common hearing person or the everyday deaf person who might not be in that specific field, to see what they are learning and what they can benefit the rest of the community, instead of looking at deaf people as, oh my gosh, those poor people, oh my gosh, that poor man, he cannot sing. All they have to do is they have to go through the snow by feeling, as opposed to saying, you know what, they might be able to do something much more efficiently, and can we apply that to everyone else? And we can help hearing people take advantage of that. So the researchers are looking at what deaf people bring from our unique experience of being deaf, what we're able to provide to the world at large. So that's just one example. But to think bigger picture,
biodiversity. When we think about the environment, environmental issues, everything depends on everything else. Things in an ecosystem are interdependent on each other. This is the fish depend on the water and the currents, and The currents clean the water, and everything's interrelated at the Great Barrier Reef. If the water wasn't right, the fish would die. If the temperature is too high, the fish would die. They need each other. So the concept of biodiversity demonstrates that it's critical to have diversity. And human diversity follows the same logic. So in studying ecology and ecosystems at the Great Barrier Reef, this has eroded in biodiversity. Everything's been dying slowly. And same thing with Brazil in the rainforests. And the number of unique species has been drastically decreasing. That's because the rainforest is dying. So when we think of human diversity, really the goal is to become more conformist. If that happens, then we die. The biodiversity dies within human biodiversity. So when we think of it as a larger system, a flourishing system, the point is that for a system to be able to flourish, there needs to be a great deal of diversity. And when everything is whittled down and weeded out to become the same, that takes away from the vibrancy of the society and doesn't allow it to flourish. You need to have diversity in order to have growth. And that's the point of having a healthy system. Instead of having a goal for everybody to become the same, that leads to a dead end. Everything needs to be changed to be diverse because that biodiversity is key when imagining a society that has positive value. It's the same concept with deaf gain. We bring to society something that's and can use, deaf people and disabled people. Without that, biodiversity decreases. So those things that we bring to society, if they're missing, that represents a partial collapse of society. Without what we contribute, that part is missing and diversity is less. This is all part of biodiversity and a network of interdependence. If one piece is missing, then diversity is lessened greatly. So how do we deal with this on an individual level? The answer is pretty interesting. Dr. Joanne Nagel from the University of Kansas, she's a sociologist, is pictured on the slide. And below her is Dr. Richard Clark Eckert from the University of Wisconsin in Richmond. They have a concept of a portfolio of identities. Dr. Joanne Nagel is hearing and Dr. Eckert is deaf. They have suggested the idea of a portfolio of identities. If you're an art major, an architecture major, a business major even, a writing major, you have a portfolio. If you're a photographer, you'll have a portfolio. And that will display your best work that you've selected from your entire body of work. So when people want to see your work before they hire you as a photographer or whatever, then you have something to demonstrate and it's ready to go. And that shows your best self, the portfolio. Depending on the job, you may prioritize a particular picture over another picture. You know, you might be hired as a wedding photographer, and so you would want to prioritize showing examples of couples that you've already taken pictures of. You would want to show that right up front in the interview. Or same thing with a newspaper reporter. If they're going to be hired as a newspaper reporter, someone would want to put their best news photos up front rather than their wedding photos. There's a variety of different skills that photographers can possess, but which one they might put up front would change depending on the situation, whichever one applies to the situation that they're trying for. So the identity portfolio is the concept of having all the labels that we accept for ourselves. The big question in the deaf-black community is, which are you first? Are you black first or are you deaf first? That's a very common question in the black-deaf community. Most in the black-deaf community reject that question altogether. They're both, and that's all there is to it. And you can't prioritize one over the other, being black or being deaf. And when the black-deaf community is together as a family, they feel that as being black and deaf rather than just being around black people or just being around deaf people. In Gallaudet, most of the students are white. Maybe a black-deaf student would feel more deaf in that situation than black, because they're more aware of the racial difference in that setting. So how you prioritize your identities, sometimes you can't in situations like that. A more healthy way to manage the variety of identities is to have this concept of a portfolio of identities. And that includes your individual identities and how you prioritize them differently depending on the situation. You don't stop being one identity in order to become another identity, but you might prioritize a particular identity over another depending on the situation that you're in. And that's just a way to manage conflicting identities through that portfolio.